Good morning. It is great to see all of you this morning, although technically I'm not seeing you this morning, but you know what I mean by that. It's great to have you in church this morning. And today we're going to do something special. I am going to lead you through the entire book of Job. Now don't panic, we're not going to go through every single verse, but there's 8 key words that we're going to go through to help us understand what this book is all about and its relevance to the struggles that you and I go through in our daily lives. Now, some of you may know the story, some of you may not, so I want to give you just a bird's eye view of the context of what is happening in this story. It begins with these words from Job 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. Job, by the way, was a contemporary of Abraham. So he lived about the same time that Abraham lived. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And so that tells you who Job was. He was a wealthy man, a great man, an honorable man. And then we're told that Satan, the accuser, comes before God's throne, and God says to Satan, this is going down to verse 8, God is speaking to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." And Satan responds in verse 10, "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." So the Lord gives Satan permission to begin an onslaught against Job, and a series of tragedies take place. He loses almost all his possessions, almost all his family is killed. Satan thinks that Job is going to curse God, but instead we're told down in verse 21, this is Job talking, after all these tragedies have happened, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Now, in verse 2, so Job maintains his faith, he maintains his commitment to God in spite of all this. And now in chapter 2, Satan is once again appearing before the Lord. And Satan says to the Lord, "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." So Satan is saying, yeah, you've taken away his family, you've taken away his possessions, but you haven't touched him. If you give me permission to attack him as a person in his body, he will curse you. And so God gives Satan permission to attack him physically, but he tells him you cannot take his life. And so in chapter 2, we see all of these terrible diseases and disfigurements and terrible physical ailments hitting Job. And that is the context around the whole rest of the book. He's lost his family, he's lost his possessions, and he's lost his health. Now let me ask you, what would you do? What would you say to God if those things happened to you? This is what we're going to look at. So if you're following along in your outlines, the first word that we looked at is tragedy. That's from Job 1 and 2. And what happened as a result of Job losing his family, his health, and his possessions? Did he curse God like Satan thought he would? Well, the next word I want us to look at is the word trust. The word trust. And this is taken from chapter 13, verse 15, where Job has this wonderful line, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." You could say, "Yet will I trust in him." In spite of all of these things that happened, Job said, "I don't care what happens, I don't care how difficult it gets, I'm going to hold on to my faith in God." Satan intended those tragedies to pull Job away from God. Instead, it drew him even closer to him. I'm standing right now in front of our church, and you'll see the little plaque here near me on the rock. It's a reminder to us that the original building that was on this site was burnt down due to fire in 1913. That was just before the First World War started. Now think about it. What the people of that day could have said. They could have said, "We're losing all of our young people. They're all going off to war. We're not going to have the income that we did. We're not going to have the resources that we did. There's no way that we can rebuild this church." They could have lost their faith. They could have given up their trust. They could have thrown in the towel. But instead they said, "We are going to trust in God, step out in faith, and rebuild this church bigger and stronger and better than it was." And in 1915, they completed the rebuilding in the middle of the war and rededicated it to the glory of God. And now, over a century later, the church is still standing. What Satan intends for ill, God uses to deepen our faith. Now, I want you to talk amongst yourself and answer this question. Has there ever been a time in your life when you have faced a tragedy or a difficulty or a crisis that could have torn you away from God, but instead God used it to bring you into a closer walk with Him? We're moving on now to the third word I want to introduce you to. And this is a word that grows out of trust. It grows out of faith. When we show trust in God, when we have faith in Him, even when everything around us is falling apart, it leads to assurance. I want to share with you these words from Job from chapter 19, beginning at verse 25. Many of you will recognize these wonderful words. They've been sung by many singers. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end He will stand on the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God." The tragedy led to trust, and the trust led to assurance. And the assurance then leads to another amazing word, and that is a word that we associate with chapter 26, the word awe. When we are assured that God cares for us, that we're safe in His hands, that He loves us, that He has time for us, that He values us, we feel awe. Listen to these words. Chapter 26, verse 13. "By His breath the skies became fair, His hand pierced the gliding serpent, and these are but the outer fringe of His works. How faint the whisper we hear of Him! Who then can understand the thunder of His power?" Do you sense the awe that he's feeling there? I can remember when I was a student at Acadia, in my first year there, I had to go through a little pathway to get from the house where I was living to the Acadia Divinity College building. And one night I'd been working late in the library. I was going home. It was a beautiful, bright, clear evening. And I looked up and I saw all of these stars and the moon, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of awe towards God. I threw my backpack down, I grabbed out my Bible, I turned to Psalm 148, and I began to read those words of praise to God for all creation. It was an experience that I have never forgotten. And I want to ask you, is there a time in your life when you've had an experience like that, where you have been filled with an overwhelming sense of awe towards God, who He is, and what He's done? Talk about that with your group right now. So Job had an amazing experience of awe as he stood before God and realized who he is and who God is, an experience that I suspect many of you have had as well. And that led to another word that we find in Job. It's the fifth one if you're following along in your outlines, and that is a deep insight. A deep insight. Listen to these words from chapter 28, verse 28. Job is speaking, and he says, "And God said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." Job understood that nothing in this world makes sense unless we start and end with God. He's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all. And that insight was to guide Job for the remainder of his life. And even in the struggles and the doubts that he has, and as you go through the rest of this book, Job has a lot of questions. He has a lot of doubts. He asks a lot of pointed questions to God. And at times he begins to doubt. But that insight into the centrality of our relationship with God was to provide the stepping stone or the foundation that God needed to teach Job a very important lesson around, and this brings us to word number 6, humility. Humility. Sometimes we forget who God is. We forget who we are. We forget our place. And God has to remind us. And I love this passage from Job 38, when God reminds Job who he is, and he asks Job a series of questions. We're told this: "The Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, 'Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy." And through this chapter, he goes on and on, asking Job question after question after question, reminding Job who he is and who God himself is. If you come normally to the traditional service, you may remember or recognize who normally sits where I am sitting. And I chose to sit in this spot when I'm talking about humility because of two people in our church who, in my opinion, are the embodiment of true Christian humility. And those people are Marshall and Hazel Thompson. They have served the Lord faithfully throughout their lives, on the mission field in Bolivia, here in Canada, in the United States. And there is nothing that they would not do for someone who was in need. They're both in their 90s now, but even as late as a couple of months ago, Marshall was in South America sharing his faith because it burns within him. Marshall and Hazel are the embodiment of humility. And as I read these verses, I'm reminded of the example that they set of true Christian humility. Let me ask you a question. Why is humility so important in the Christian life? Why is it so vital for believers that we develop this quality of humility? Discuss this amongst yourselves. So the Lord taught Job humility. And that quality of humility is so important in the Christian life because it led to a spiritual breakthrough. Remember that God in chapter 38 and 39 and beyond asks Job a whole series of questions. And those questions, designed to remind Job who he is, led to a spiritual breakthrough. That's the seventh word, breakthrough. And in chapter 42, in verse 4, Job says to God, "You said," he's saying to God, "You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me." And then Job responds, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Again, my ears had heard of you. I knew about you, but now my eyes have seen you. That is the amazing experience that the Christian enjoys. Before we become believers, we hear about God, but when we encounter Him, our eyes see Him. The eyes of faith see Him. And that is the beginning, the true beginning of growth in the Christian life, when we see God and recognize Him for who He is and ourselves for who we are. And when Job has this breakthrough, it leads to the eighth word, the final word, which is God's commendation. Notice at verse 7, chapter 42, verse 7, we have the epilogue, and this is what happens. After the Lord had said these things to Job, He said to Eliphaz the Temanite, that's one of the comforters that Job had, "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." So we're told Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite did what the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. This was an amazing journey that Job went through over the course of a few days, few weeks. An amazing journey. But at the very end, it was all worth it, because he could say, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." My prayer for each of you is that you will be able to say that as well.